Hello everyone. In episode 1 of this podcast, I interviewed Professor Christine Keneally about the reality of the famine. In that episode, we mentioned some names and faces, but most of the people we named are the well-known ones, the politicians, the judges. But what was it like for the ordinary people, the people who died and who just became one of a number? Well, in our poets series that we're currently doing, our next poet, Eavan Boland, was fascinated by that idea of the hidden people behind the numbers, and set her life goal to represent them. So, let's jump into our time machine and set our dials for the birth of poet Eavan Boland. Let's go. It's the 24th of September, 1944, and Eavan Boland is born in Dublin, the capital city of the infant state known as the Republic of Ireland. Now, on the podcast, we've become quite used to men from agricultural backgrounds, think both Seamus Heaney and Harry Ferguson. But for Eavan, her upbringing almost couldn't be more different. Whereas Seamus couldn't cope with the poetry of the aristocracy, you could almost say that Eavan is the aristocracy. But I'm sure she'd hate that, so let's just say she is from an affluent family, shall we? Her father is Frederick Boland, a career diplomat who will, in a few short years, get to be ambassador in a nation whose people will have a massive effect on the child Eavan. Remember, Ireland is only an official state as of 1939, so we're only 5 years on. As a result, Frederick is literally one of the first men to represent the Republic of Ireland on the world stage. A man who is instrumental in setting the tone and stage, to double my metaphors, on what this small nation on the edge of the Atlantic would become. Eavan came to realise that history is, in a lot of cases, not the exact truth of the past, or what might have been, but the version of events agreed upon by people in power. And then there's her mother. Frances Boland, born Frances Kelly, is an expressionist painter. She doesn't paint to show things how they are, but rather how they feel, both physically and, more importantly, emotionally. Eavan Boland absolutely soaks this up. She later remembers how, one day, at 6 or 7 years old, she walks up to her mother's studio and stands staring at an easel, not with a portrait of a dignitary, but with a highly detailed, single, human eyebrow painted on it. This reality set a fire of love in Eavan for all the little things of life. A fire is set in Eavan to represent the hidden parts of history, something that I myself love, rather than the official narrative that her father and his co-workers would be used to. Now, childhood is hard enough for the best of us, but what happens next is hard, yes, but also massively important in Eavan's life. In 1951, when she is 6, her father becomes ambassador to the United Kingdom, and 6-year-old Eavan moves to London with her family. Ireland at the time was essentially a heroic but ultimately defeated country. Now she is moving to exactly where her overlords come from. Her Irishness became her otherness. She feels like a stranded teenager, unable to articulate the nature of her own country, until forced to defend it against hostile comments in Britain and, later, the US. It's like when you can't perceive a pattern if you're too close, but only when you step back. Many of you listeners who are part of the diaspora will understand. You often have to leave a place to truly perceive its historical weight. And if you really want to know what she thinks, may I suggest reading her poem, An Irish Childhood in England, 1951. However, ambassadorial duties don't last forever, so she returns to Ireland in 1958 at 14 years old, attending Holy Child Secondary School, Killiney, County Dublin. A year later, at 15, there is a pivotal moment. She takes the bus one day into the city, into Hodges Figgis bookshop, Eavan Boland buys a hardback, burgundy-coloured copy of W.B. Yeats's poems. Her mind is absolutely and utterly blown. She realises that a poet can, in a way, build their own landscape, their own country, their own world, out of rhyme, metre and myth. Yeats, as I'm sure you will know, is a hugely important figure around the time of Ireland finding its own cultural identity in the struggle for independence. So much so that I'm slightly disappointed I didn't think of him as someone to do an episode on for the series. Anywho, just like Seamus Heaney, her mind is opened by reading poetry, and she takes it into her college studies in her local college, Trinity College, Dublin. Now, Heaney published his first work called 11 Poems. Well, during first year in college, Eavan Boland kind of takes a leaf out of his book and publishes a pamphlet called 23 Poems. 5 years later, in 1967, her first book, New Territory, lands on bookshelves. Now, if you remember from one of our last episodes about the literary scene at the time, it is, firstly, focused on places like private homes and pubs, and is, at the risk of sounding feminist, which I absolutely am not, male-dominated. Also, as we described with her contemporary Seamus Heaney, there is very much a set few topics that are thought of as being worthy of discussion in poetry. Farming, civilian life, and definitely childbirth are most definitely not in that list. Starting off, Eavan could do a Heaney on it, so to speak, and launch straight into a different type of more earthy poetry, but instead she tries to master the form expected of Irish poets at the time, and it absolutely works. From the time she releases New Territory, that book, Boland is quickly considered as good, if not better, than many of her peers. But she does realise that this success is built on expressing a narrative she herself does not believe in. She realises that every young writer almost certainly starts by mimicking someone else's poem before striking out on their own. In 1969, Eavan Boland gets married and, again much like Seamus Heaney in my previous episode, this is pivotal in her life. Boland and novelist Kevin Casey have two daughters, Sarah Margaret, born in 1975, and Eavan Frances, born in 1978. Also, they move, similar to Seamus Heaney, they move to the suburb of Dundrum, County Dublin. Now, in Ireland in the 70s, marriage was often a case for a woman of that being the end of her working life. Not so for Eavan. She did transition from the hustle and bustle of a city life to domestic life. However, something like Heaney, Eavan Boland takes a look around her and thinks to herself, instead of seeing the dailiness of existence as she calls it, she thinks, I can write about these things. Why not? These things, as discussed in the Heaney episodes, aren't exactly to the forefront of Irish poetry, but rather than see it as a blockage, Eavan sees it as an opportunity, much like an if you want something done, do it yourself attitude. So that is exactly what she does. Take, for example, her poem, Night Feed. Eavan uses the early mornings before milkmen make their rounds, before bread is being baked, and crucially, before her children are awake, to write her poems. She writes about being a housewife to this nursery where you hold on to your life. And let's not forget, her work is not just trivial, but historical preservation and documentation. As we mentioned earlier, Boland defines a difference between history and the past, between curated versions of events and real, gritty human lives. She's like an archaeologist who, instead of looking for the brooches and swords of aristocracy, looks for the tools and ploughs of the ordinary man, so to speak, to show how the everyday citizen survived, felt, and endured. The curation of the ordinary, you might say. Also, as her children grow up, so too does her poetry. A prime example is a poem that I myself did in secondary school, The Pomegranate. Eavan manages to see, in a pomegranate, her daughter is half-eaten, a connection between the modern day and the ancient Greek myth of Persephone, which also features a pomegranate. This myth of Persephone is a foundational ancient Greek story explaining the changing of the seasons and the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. In the myth, Ceres, goddess of the harvest, has her daughter stolen by the lord of the underworld. However, once she is found, here enters the pomegranate. Before she leaves, she eats a few pomegranate seeds. However, this binds her to returning to the underworld for a portion of every year. This was, the Greeks believed, the explanation for autumn and winter. One day, Boland walks into her daughter's room to find her asleep, surrounded by the ancient and the new, a pomegranate, teen magazines, and a can of Coke. Coca-Cola now, not cocaine. Anyway. And the pomegranate is not just a link to the ancient, but rather a reminder that the teenage girl has entered the winter of her childhood, and Eavan must get ready for the inevitable, necessary separation about to come. Boland recognises that by trying to grasp or to intervene, she will actively diminish the gift of her daughter's independence. Eavan Boland is making the claim through her poem Pomegranate that the separation of her and her daughter in suburban Dublin is just as important, earth-shattering and record-worthy as the myth of Ceres and Persephone. But hey, this is a history podcast, so time for some real-time reaction. In the 70s and early 80s, when Boland is starting out, the establishment categorises the publications as just women's issues and domestic triviality. Technically proficient, but lacking the necessary weight and gravity that historical literature should have. That a poem about a night feed just does not have the same weight as the Easter Rising or Civil War. That it fundamentally could not be admitted to eternal entry. Accused of shrinking the scope of Irish literature, she could go away and lick her wounds. But of course, Eavan Boland does not. She writes articles criticising the gatekeepers of history, claiming that a record that silences half the population is just a self-serving fiction. Through the 70s and 80s, Eavan, slowly but surely, keeps releasing her poetry, unabashed by the criticism, giving a voice to the everyday life of the world. In we go to the 90s. Eavan Boland recognises that maybe, just maybe, her poetry will satisfy the masses if she writes about something which is of significance, as the establishment would call it, but from the more hidden personal viewpoint she is so passionate about. Enter her poem Quarantine, published first just after the 90s in 2001. It is set in the brutal winter of Black 47, the worst year of the famine. If you research the famine today, most of what you find is crop yield figures, tons of grain exported, bare numbers of deaths, things like that. However, Eavan Boland, somewhat like me to be honest, is more interested in the actual real people behind the figures. She hears the story of a man and his wife found dead on the road at the time, and decides to write their story in poetic form. They have died from famine fever, which was a code name for something like typhus, spread by lice and overcrowded unsanitary conditions in the 1840s. In quarantine, the couple are walking a road, but the woman is struggling. Even though he too is using the last of his energy, the man lifts his wife and carries her. In the morning, they are found on the road, dead. Boland describes them dying not just from exposure and illness, but, and I quote, from the toxins of a whole history. When found, her feet rest against his breastbone. The last of his heat is his final desperate gift to his dying wife. At the end, Boland insists, let no love poem ever come to this threshold. She is well and truly fed up of the over-sentimentalization which often surrounds depictions of death in literature. This is particularly striking when you think of all the heroic, mythic qualities endowed upon the likes of the Civil War and Easter Rising. Overall, Eavan tries to show that if the only thing referenced in history is the upper class and government achievements of the day, then it is not just incomplete, but is a literal lie. Through these poems, it is clear that Eavan moved from a somewhat timid, unsure young woman trying to fit into the already established world of poetry to a woman who decided enough was enough and to fill the potholes, so to speak, in the long and winding road of the historical narrative. But, like all people, there has to be an end to her story. In her later years, just like Seamus Heaney, Eavan Boland becomes a professor at an American university, in her case, Stanford. She spends her time passing her knowledge to the next generation, teaching how to observe and present the unrecorded past as part of their creative writing program. Of course, she couldn't fully detach herself from her beloved homeland and frequently returned. Eavan Boland died on the 27th of April 2020. In a fitting end to this story, her estate publishes a collection of never-before-seen poetry posthumously, which means after she died. It wins the Costa Book Award for Poetry. Its title? The Historians. It is almost as if she is saying, through the written word, I'm one of you now, right? Thanks for listening. Like this if you can, tell me what you did and didn't like, follow me on Instagram at Liam Blake Podcaster, and Substack at the History and Heritage Podcast. And most importantly of all, tell everyone about the History and Heritage Podcast. Bye!